New York, 1942. The war had already reached the Atlantic. German U-boats were hunting Allied ships along the American coastline, sinking tankers within sight of U.S. cities. Oil burned on the water. Sailors died only miles from shore. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Americans realized something unsettling. The war was not far away. It was already here. But what worried U.S. military intelligence even more was not happening in the ocean. It was happening inside America's largest port. The Port of New York was the beating heart of the Allied war effort. Every day, thousands of tons of weapons, vehicles, ammunition, and food were loaded onto ships bound for Europe. If that harbor stopped functioning, even for a few days, it could slow the entire Allied supply chain. And then strange things started happening. Ships caught fire while still docked. Cargo mysteriously disappeared. Workers whispered about German agents hiding among the longshoremen. Then, on February 9th, 1942, disaster struck. The French ocean liner Normandie, one of the largest ships in the world, was being converted into a U.S. troop transport at Pier 88 in Manhattan. During the work, a small spark ignited a pile of life jackets. Within minutes, the fire was out of control. Flames climbed the massive decks. Firefighters flooded the ship with water in a desperate attempt to save it. Hours later, the once luxurious liner rolled onto its side and capsized in the harbor. The image of the fallen giant shocked the country. Officials feared the worst: sabotage. If enemy agents could destroy a ship inside the most important port in America, what else could they do? The U.S. Navy launched an urgent investigation, but they quickly ran into a problem. They did not control the docks. The unions, the cargo operations, the workers moving every crate and every barrel. All of it operated under a different authority: the Mafia. For decades, organized crime had quietly dominated the New York waterfront. Longshoremen unions, trucking companies, warehouse crews. Many of them answered not to the government, but to powerful crime families. If a stranger appeared on the docks, the Mafia knew. If someone was asking questions, the Mafia heard about it. If sabotage was being planned in the harbor, the Mafia might see it before anyone else. Inside a prison cell hundreds of miles away sat the one man who still held influence over that entire criminal empire. His name was Charles Lucky Luciano. He had built the modern American Mafia. And although he was serving a 30 to 50-year sentence in a New York prison, everyone knew one thing: Luciano still had power. Soon, an extraordinary idea began circulating within U.S. Naval Intelligence. If the government could not control the docks, maybe the men who already controlled them could. In one of the strangest alliances of the Second World War, the United States Navy was about to make a secret deal with the American Mafia. In early 1942, the Port of New York was the most important harbor in the world. From Brooklyn to Hoboken, the waterfront stretched for miles, crowded with cargo ships, oil tankers, troop transports, and military supply vessels. Day and night, cranes swung over the docks, lifting crates of ammunition, trucks, aircraft parts, and food bound for Europe. Nearly 3/4 of all American military supplies heading to the European front passed through this single harbor. If New York stopped moving, the Allied war effort would slow to a crawl. But there was a problem. The U.S. Navy did not truly control the waterfront. On paper, the docks belonged to the city and the shipping companies. In reality, they belonged to the longshoremen's unions, and the unions were heavily influenced by organized crime. For decades, the New York Mafia had built a quiet but powerful presence along the docks. Through union leaders, labor bosses, trucking companies, and warehouse operators, the crime families controlled who worked, who loaded cargo, and who moved goods in and out of the port. Nothing happened on the waterfront without someone in the underworld knowing about it. A stranger asking questions, a new worker appearing on a pier, a suspicious shipment. Word traveled fast. That system of control had been profitable for the Mafia for years. But now, with the United States at war, it created a dangerous vulnerability. The government feared that German intelligence could easily exploit the chaos of the docks. Thousands of workers moved through the harbor every day. Background checks were rare. Identification systems were almost non-existent. Anyone with the right connections could get a job unloading ships or transporting cargo. And if a German agent wanted to sabotage the war effort, the New York harbor was the perfect place to do it. The threat wasn't theoretical. German submarines were already operating along the American coastline in what became known as Operation Drumbeat. Beginning in January 1942, U-boats sank dozens of Allied ships off the eastern seaboard. Oil tankers burned in the night within sight of American beaches. The Atlantic had become a battlefield. American intelligence feared that the next phase of German strategy might involve sabotage inside U.S. ports. And then came the disaster that confirmed their worst fears. On February 9, 1942, the luxury liner SS Normandie caught fire at Pier 88 in Manhattan. Before the war, Normandie had been one of the most famous ships in the world, a floating palace of Art Deco design and French engineering. After the fall of France, the United States had seized the vessel and planned to convert it into a troop transport under the name USS Lafayette. Workers were installing new equipment inside the ship when sparks from a welding torch ignited a stack of life jackets. The fire spread rapidly. Within minutes, flames tore through the upper decks. Firefighters pumped massive amounts of water into the vessel in an attempt to extinguish the blaze. But the water created a new problem. Normandie began to list. By the early hours of the next morning, the massive ship rolled onto its side and collapsed into the harbor. New York woke up to the shocking image of one of the world's largest ships, lying half-submerged beside Manhattan. The official cause would later be ruled an accident. But at the time, few people believed that. Rumors spread quickly through military intelligence and the press. Some believed German agents had infiltrated the docks. Others suspected saboteurs hiding among the longshoremen. Whether sabotage had actually occurred almost didn't matter. The Navy realized something far more alarming. If enemy agents were operating in the harbor, the U.S. government had no reliable way to detect them. But someone else did. The men who controlled the docks. And behind that system of control stood a criminal empire built by one man, a man who was currently sitting in a prison cell. His name was Lucky Luciano. By the time the United States entered World War II, Charles Lucky Luciano was already a legend in the criminal underworld. Born Salvatore Lucania in 1897 in Sicily, he had immigrated to New York as a child and grown up in the rough streets of Manhattan's Lower East Side. By his 20s, Luciano had already built connections with some of the most dangerous figures in organized crime. But Luciano was different from the gangsters who came before him. He was not interested in small turf wars or chaotic street violence. What he wanted was organization. In the early 1930s, after a brutal internal conflict known as the Castellamarese War, Luciano reshaped the structure of American organized crime. Instead of rival gangs constantly fighting each other, he created a national system of cooperation. The Mafia would now operate like a corporation. Luciano divided New York into 5 powerful crime families, each controlling its own territory but answering to a central governing body known as the Commission. This structure stabilized the underworld and allowed organized crime to expand into new industries: gambling, labor unions, trucking, and shipping. One of the most valuable areas to control was the New York waterfront. The docks were a gateway for enormous amounts of cargo entering and leaving the country. Whoever controlled the unions and the labor bosses could influence the entire flow of goods. Luciano's associates understood that perfectly. Through a network of union officials, enforcers, and middlemen, the Mafia slowly tightened its grip on the waterfront. Longshoremen who wanted steady work often had to cooperate with crime family representatives. Trucking companies paid protection money. Warehouse operators followed the rules, set by the men who truly ran the docks. By the late 1930s, organized crime had become deeply embedded in the harbor economy, but Luciano himself would not be there to enjoy it. In 1936, New York prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey launched a massive campaign against organized crime. Dewey had built his reputation by targeting bootleggers and racketeers, and Luciano became his most famous target. Luciano was arrested and charged with running a large-scale prostitution ring. After a highly publicized trial, he was convicted and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. It was a dramatic victory for law enforcement. Luciano was transferred to Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, a remote prison in upstate New York near the Canadian border. Later, he would be moved to Great Meadow Prison in Comstock. Officially, the most powerful mob boss in America was now locked behind bars. But prison walls did not erase influence. Luciano's criminal network had been carefully designed to survive exactly this situation. His allies, men like Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, and Albert Anastasia, continued to manage the families and enforce the system Luciano had created. And along the New York waterfront, that system remained firmly in place. Every ship that arrived, every cargo crate that moved, every longshoreman hired for a shift. Someone in the underworld knew about it, which meant that when the U.S. Navy began searching for a way to secure the harbor during wartime, they faced a difficult reality. The government had soldiers, it had ships, it had intelligence agencies, but it did not have eyes and ears on the docks. The Mafia did, and the man who could still influence that entire network was sitting quietly in a prison cell hundreds of miles away. Soon, American Naval Intelligence would begin asking a question that would have seemed impossible only a few years earlier. What if the United States government asked the Mafia for help? The fire on the Normandie forced the U.S. Navy to confront an uncomfortable truth. America's most important harbor was a maze of competing interests: shipping companies, unions, trucking firms, warehouse crews, and thousands of longshoremen moving cargo day and night. Military patrols could guard the entrances to the harbor, but they had almost no visibility inside the daily life of the docks. If sabotage was happening there, the Navy would likely learn about it after it was too late. One of the men assigned to solve this problem was Commander Charles R. Haffenden, a Canadian-born officer working with U.S. Naval Intelligence and Port Security. Haffenden spent weeks studying how the waterfront actually functioned. The more he learned, the clearer the picture became. The docks were not controlled by the government. They were controlled by organized crime. Workers listened to union bosses. Union bosses answered to people higher up in the underworld hierarchy. Those networks had existed for decades and were deeply embedded in the everyday operation of the port. Haffenden came to a radical conclusion. If the Navy wanted to know what was happening on the docks, it needed access to the people who already ran them. In early 1942, American intelligence quietly began reaching out to intermediaries connected to the New York Mafia. The first contact was not Lucky Luciano himself. Instead, investigators approached Joseph Sox Lanza, a powerful figure in the Fulton fish market, one of the most tightly controlled Mafia strongholds on the waterfront. Lanza had influence over hundreds of workers moving seafood shipments through Manhattan's markets and docks. His cooperation could help authorities monitor activity along key sections of the harbor. But Lanza was not the real prize. Everyone knew that the criminal network along the docks ultimately traced back to Luciano's system. Even from prison, his name still carried enormous weight inside the Mafia. Naval Intelligence began exploring the possibility of contacting him. That idea required navigating layers of legal and political risk. Luciano was one of the most famous convicted criminals in the United States. Any official cooperation with him could create a scandal if it became public. But wartime priorities were different. By the summer of 1942, arrangements were made for government representatives to approach Luciano inside prison. The meeting was discreet, carefully managed through intermediaries connected to the Mafia leadership. The proposal was simple. The Navy needed information. It needed the docks watched. It needed anyone suspicious, foreign agents, saboteurs, unknown workers, to be reported immediately. In return, the government hinted that Luciano's situation might improve. Prison conditions could become easier, and when the war eventually ended, his case might be reconsidered. For Luciano, the offer was tempting. He had been sentenced to spend most of his life behind bars. Even the possibility of reduced restrictions, or eventual freedom, was worth considering. More importantly, cooperating with the government would reinforce his influence inside the Mafia. Even from prison, he could demonstrate that he remained a powerful figure capable of negotiating with the United States itself. Luciano agreed. Soon afterward, subtle changes began to appear along the waterfront. Union leaders suddenly became more cooperative with port authorities. Suspicious individuals asking questions about cargo movements were quickly reported, or quietly pushed away from the docks. Longshoremen began passing along information about strangers or unusual activity. The Navy had not taken control of the harbor, but through the Mafia, it had gained something almost as valuable: eyes and ears everywhere. After the agreement was in place, the atmosphere along the New York waterfront began to change. Not publicly, not officially, but anyone who worked on the docks could feel it. For years, the harbor had been chaotic. Thousands of workers moving cargo, trucks arriving at all hours, ships loading day and night. It was the perfect environment for theft, corruption, and occasionally violence. Fights between workers were common. Cargo sometimes disappeared. Fires or accidents were not unusual. But now something else appeared: control. Longshoremen began noticing that unfamiliar faces didn't last long on the docks. A stranger asking too many questions might suddenly be surrounded by men who politely, but firmly, suggested he leave. Workers who behaved suspiciously sometimes simply stopped showing up for shifts. The waterfront had always been watched by the Mafia. Now, it was being watched more carefully than ever. Naval Intelligence officers soon began receiving small but useful pieces of information. Dock workers reported unusual movements around certain warehouses. Shipping schedules were quietly shared. Rumors circulating among labor crews reached the ears of military investigators. None of this appeared in official reports, but it helped the Navy understand something critical: what was actually happening inside the harbor each day. One of the key figures enforcing this new order was Albert Anastasia, a feared Mafia leader who controlled much of Brooklyn's waterfront operations. Anastasia had earned a reputation as one of the most dangerous men in organized crime. He had once been a leading member of the notorious murder syndicate known as Murder Inc., but he was also an effective organizer. Through Anastasia's influence, dock workers and union leaders made it clear that sabotage would not be tolerated. The docks were now under strict supervision, not by the government, but by the criminal networks that had controlled them for decades. For Naval Intelligence, the results were exactly what they had hoped for. Suspicious incidents on the waterfront began to decline. Cargo moved more smoothly. Ships loaded and departed without the disruptions that had worried military planners earlier in the war. Historians still debate how much of this change was directly caused by the Mafia's cooperation. The fire aboard Normandie, for example, was later determined to have been an accident rather than enemy sabotage. But at the time, the U.S. Navy believed it had solved a serious security problem, and the partnership was about to become even more valuable, because in 1943, the war was moving closer to Luciano's homeland. The Allies were preparing for one of the most important invasions of the war. The target was Sicily, and suddenly, the Mafia's influence extended far beyond the docks of New York. By early 1943, the Allied war strategy had shifted. After defeating German and Italian forces in North Africa, The next step was clear. The Allies needed to invade southern Europe. The island of Sicily became the obvious target. Capturing it would open the Mediterranean to Allied shipping and create a pathway into mainland Italy. The operation was given the name Operation Husky. It would become one of the largest amphibious invasions in history up to that point. More than 150,000 Allied troops, thousands of ships, and hundreds of aircraft would participate in the assault on the island. But military planners faced a serious problem. They knew surprisingly little about Sicily. Accurate maps were limited. Intelligence on coastal defenses was incomplete. Even basic information about local roads, villages, and terrain was unreliable. American and British commanders feared that once their troops landed, they could face fierce resistance in unfamiliar territory. That was when intelligence officers remembered something unusual. Many of the Mafia figures who controlled parts of New York's waterfront had originally come from Sicily. Their families were still there. Their connections ran deep into the island's villages, farms, and local power structures. Through intermediaries linked to Lucky Luciano, American authorities began exploring whether these old connections could help the invasion. One of the most frequently mentioned names in this story is Calogero, Don Calo Vizzini, a powerful Sicilian mafia boss from the town of Villalba. Vizzini had survived under Mussolini's dictatorship, even though the fascist government had attempted to crush the mafia in the 1920s and 1930s. By the time Allied forces prepared to invade Sicily, Vizzini was once again an influential figure on the island. Some accounts claim that mafia contacts helped Allied intelligence understand the local terrain and political landscape. Others suggest that mafia networks encouraged villagers not to resist the advancing Allied forces once the invasion began. What is certain is that when Allied troops landed in Sicily on July 10, 1943, they encountered less organized resistance in many rural areas than military planners had feared. American units moving through western Sicily sometimes found local officials surprisingly cooperative. In several towns, individuals with mafia connections quickly emerged as intermediaries between the population and the occupying Allied authorities. After the invasion, some of these figures were even appointed as temporary mayors or administrators in towns where the fascist government had collapsed. Historians still debate how significant the mafia's role truly was. Some researchers believe the influence of Luciano's network has been exaggerated over time, turning a limited intelligence connection into a dramatic wartime legend. Others argue that mafia contacts genuinely helped smooth the Allied advance in parts of Sicily. But one thing is clear. By the middle of 1943, the strange relationship between the American government and organized crime had expanded far beyond the docks of New York. A secret wartime alliance had reached across the Atlantic, and at the center of it all remained the same man who had first agreed to help the Navy from inside a prison cell. Lucky Luciano. By the end of World War II, the alliance between the U.S. government and the Mafia had quietly run its course. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, and American authorities began reviewing the agreements that had been made during the conflict. Among the cases quietly discussed behind closed doors was the fate of Lucky Luciano. Officially, Luciano was still serving a 30 to 50-year sentence for his 1936 conviction. But during the war, he had spent years cooperating with Naval Intelligence through the networks he controlled on the waterfront. The question now was simple. Should the government honor its side of the deal? The answer came from an unexpected figure, the same man who had once put Luciano in prison. Thomas E. Dewey, the former prosecutor who had built his career on Luciano's conviction, was now the governor of New York. Dewey was fully aware of the wartime arrangement between Luciano and the Navy. Naval intelligence officials quietly acknowledged that Luciano's cooperation had been useful in securing the harbor during the early years of the war. In January 1946, Governor Dewey announced a controversial decision. Luciano's sentence would be commuted, but there was a condition. Luciano would not be allowed to remain in the United States. Instead, he would be deported to Italy, the country where he had been born nearly 50 years earlier. On February 10, 1946, Luciano was placed aboard a ship and sent across the Atlantic under government supervision. After years behind bars in American prisons, he was suddenly free, but permanently exiled. When he arrived in Naples, Luciano quickly re-entered the world he knew best. From Italy, he maintained connections with criminal networks across Europe, the Caribbean, and the United States. Some investigators later suspected that Luciano played a role in expanding international narcotics trafficking during the post-war years, though he always denied direct involvement. What remained unclear to the public for decades was the full extent of his wartime cooperation with the United States government. The details of Operation Underworld were never openly discussed during the war. Much of the information remained buried in military reports, intelligence files, and testimony that would only surface years later. For most Americans, the idea that the U.S. Navy had secretly worked with organized crime seemed almost impossible. Yet, the story refused to disappear. Over time, fragments of the operation emerged through investigations, declassified documents, and testimony from people who had been involved. They revealed a wartime reality that was far more complicated than official histories often suggested. In the desperate early years of World War II, the United States had made an unusual choice. To protect its most important harbor, the government had turned to the men who already controlled it, the Mafia. For years after the war, the story of the Navy and the Mafia remained buried in fragments. Officially, there had been no alliance. The U.S. government never publicly announced any cooperation with organized crime. No press conferences, no medals, no official recognition. But slowly, pieces of the story began to surface. In the 1950s, a series of investigations into organized crime brought unexpected testimony into the public record. During the famous Kefauver Committee hearings, which examined the influence of the Mafia across the United States, hints of wartime cooperation began appearing in witness statements. Later, in the 1954 New York State Crime Commission investigation, officials questioned naval officers and intelligence personnel about the events surrounding the New York waterfront during the war. Some of them admitted what had long been suspected. The Navy had indeed contacted figures connected to the Mafia in order to secure the docks. The operation became known publicly as Operation Underworld. Documents and testimonies revealed that Naval Intelligence had relied on intermediaries, such as Joseph Sox Lanza, along with Mafia figures connected to Albert Anastasia and other leaders controlling parts of the waterfront. Their role was not to fight the war. Their job was much simpler, and in some ways, more effective. Watch the docks, listen for rumors, identify strangers, report anything that might threaten the ships leaving New York Harbor. In a place where thousands of workers moved every day and official surveillance was nearly impossible, the Mafia already had something the government lacked: a system of control built on loyalty, fear, and reputation. Historians still argue about how much impact this cooperation actually had. Some believe the threat of sabotage was exaggerated, and that the Navy simply overreacted after the Normandy disaster. Others believe the Mafia's involvement genuinely helped stabilize the harbor at a critical moment in the war. The truth may lie somewhere in between. What is certain is that the arrangement revealed something uncomfortable about wartime decision-making. When the stakes were high enough, even a government at war with dictatorship and organized violence was willing to work with criminals. It was not a partnership built on trust. It was built on necessity. And when the war ended, both sides quietly stepped away from the agreement. The Navy returned to official security operations. The Mafia returned to its shadow world.